Today, we will see how do we factor trinomials when the leading coefficient is not 1. So here we have an expression which they're asking us to factor it out. Now I notice that it's a trinomial, 3 terms, and I also notice that the leading coefficient is not 1. Here the leading coefficient is 3. Again, the leading coefficient is a number in front of the p squared, x squared, any number raised to a second exponent. That's the leading coefficient. So whenever that number is any number besides 1, then we gotta apply the following. So remember, here we just want to factor it out. So we can apply the regular factor rules that we know. I like to use the x method. Imagine that you're just gonna factor it out like if it was a regular trinomial with the leading coefficient 1. So I'm gonna use the x method. So again, we draw an x method. The number that will go on top is the multiplication of the first and the last, so 3 times -5, that's -15, and the middle number is -2, so I put -2 here. So what are we doing here? We're looking for two numbers, which I will place them here, such that if I multiply those two numbers, it gets me the top, which is -15, and if you add those two numbers, it gets me the bottom, which is -2. Now we can see that those numbers are 3 and 5. 3 times 5 is -15, 3 and 5, so no, -5. So 3 times -5, that's -15. 3 plus -5, that gives me -2. So those are the two numbers which I was looking for, which coincidentally, I can use those two numbers to rewrite the middle number. Okay, so let's try to rewrite the middle number using those two numbers. Okay, so we're gonna have 3p squared, and instead of writing -2p, I'm gonna write it as plus 3p, which is the first number that I found, minus 5p, which is the second number that I found, minus 5. So notice that all I did here, I just rewrote the middle number. Instead of writing it as 2p, I wrote it as 3p minus 5p, because 3p minus 5p is -2p, which is what I started with. Okay, so all I did, I just rewrote the middle number using the factors that I found. Now, why did I write it this way? It's because now we have 4 terms, and now we can factor by grouping. Okay, so again, how do we factor by grouping? I'm going to look at the first 2 terms, make it a group. I'm going to look at the second 2 terms. Well, let me not do this. Let me actually rewrite in different colors, just like I did in the previous video. So I'm going to look at the first group, 3p squared, 3p. I'm going to put them in one group, plus, and I'm going to look at the second group, -5p, minus 5. So again, just like in the previous video, all I did, I grabbed the first 2 terms here, and I make it into a group, and I look at the second 2 groups, and I made it into groups. Now we can factor by grouping, just like we did in the first video. Let's look at the blue group. Is there anything that you can factor it out? Well, I see that on the first group, the greatest common factor is 3p, or the greatest thing that you can factor out is 3p. Both of them, what's the greatest number they have in common? 3, so I can take out a 3. What's the greatest variable that they have in common? P, so I take out a p. So the greatest common factor is 3p. So what do we have left? We have p plus 1. Okay, because if you multiply 3p times p, 3p squared, so I know we're good. 3p times 1 is 3p, so I know we're good. I just factor it out, nothing fancy there. So now I'm going to look at the second group, so plus. What is it that the greatest thing that they have in common? I see that the greatest thing they have in common is -5, so I'm going to take out that -5. So -5. There's plus or minus, there's no need to write plus or minus, so I'm going to write some minus. So I choose -5. So -5. So if I take out a -5, what is left? I see that p plus 1 is left. multiply them, negative 5 times p, negative 5p, negative 5 times 1, negative 5. Okay, so now we're almost done here. Remember that in factoring by grouping, once you take out the greatest common factor, the outsides, you're going to write them as a single group. So the outside is 3p minus 5. That's my first group. And my second group is the parentheses that got repeated. So plus p plus 5, p plus 1, sorry. And this is it. We're not solving, we're just factoring. So this is the factor form. Okay. So this is basically how you factor when the leading coefficient is not 1. You rewrite the middle number, just like we did here. And then we apply factor by grouping. Okay, let's apply another example. Now we have it here. Leading coefficient is not 1, so I gotta do the whole process. Okay, so let's start with the x method. The number that will go on top is the multiplication of the first and the last. So negative 2 times negative 9, that's negative 18. And the middle is 3. Okay, so I'm going to look for two numbers that if I multiply them, it gets me negative 18. And if I add them up, it gets me positive 3. So those two numbers are 6 and negative 3. 6 times negative 3, it does give me negative 18. 6 plus negative 3, it does give me 3. Okay, which we can use these two numbers to rewrite the middle number. Again, we can rewrite the middle number using those two numbers. So let's do that. So now we're going to have 2n squared. And instead of writing as 3n, I'm going to write it as plus 6n, which is the first number, minus 3n, negative 9. Again, all I did here, I rewrote the middle number, or the middle term, as the two terms that I found out using factoring. This is regular factoring. Regular factoring, okay? So now, why did I write it that way? It's because if I write it this way, then I can apply factoring by grouping, okay? So let's see. Let's group them again. Let's look at the first group, which is the first two terms. Let me rewrite it. 2n squared plus 6n. That's the first group. For my second group, plus negative 3n minus 9. Okay, I didn't do anything. All I did, I just group them. Now let's see. Let's look at the blue group. Is there anything that I can factor it out? Well, I see that the greatest number that you can factor out is a 2. The greatest number that 2 and 6 have in common is a 2, so I can factor a 2. What's the greatest variable that I can factor out? N squared and n, so I can factor in n. So what do I have left? I have n plus 3. Okay, it's 2n times n, 2n squared. 2n times 3, 6n. So now let's look at the red group now. What's the greatest number that I can factor out? What's the greatest number that negative 3 and negative 9 have in common? That would be negative 3. Okay, so if I factor out negative 3, what do I have left? I have an n, and I have a plus 3. Okay, now that I'm to this form, what do you notice? They have the same parentheses, so I know very good when it comes to factor by grouping. So my last step is to just group them once again, outsides with outsides. So let's finish it up here. So I have 2n minus 3, and that parenthesis that repeated is n plus 3. And again, this is what I was looking for. All I'm doing is to factor out. So this is the factor form. Because again, my direction was just to factor. It didn't say to solve, so we're just factoring, that's all. So we got two examples here. Now let's look at the third one. Now, again, look at it, identify what I have to do. The greatest common factor, the leading coefficient is 3. It's not 1, it's a trinomial, so I gotta do the whole process, okay? So let's start. First, use the x method to factor it out. What's the number that goes on top? The multiplication of the first and the last. 3 times 4, that's 12. Middle number, -8. So I'm looking for two numbers such that if I multiply them, it gives me positive 12, and if I add them up, it gets me -8. So I see that those two numbers are -6 and -2. Let's check. -6 times -2, it is positive 12, so we're good. -6 minus 2, so that's -8, so we're good. So now, let's rewrite the middle term. In this case, it's -an. Let's rewrite the middle term using the two numbers that we found using the regular x method. So let's rewrite the equation. So I'm going to have 3n squared, and instead of writing as -an, I'm going to write as -6n minus 2n plus 4. Okay. Now that I have it in four terms, we're going to do factor by grouping. So let me just group them. 2n squared. I'm going to get the first two terms plus, and I'm going to look at the second two terms, -2n plus 4. Again, I grab those two terms, I put them in a group. I grab the first two terms, I put them as a group. So now that I have two groups, I'm going to concentrate one individually. So let's look at the red group. What's the greatest common factor that you notice here? What's the greatest number that 3 and -6 have in common? That will be 3. What's the greatest variable that n squared and n have in common? So 3n. So the greatest common factor is 3n. So what do I have left? I have n, and I have negative, what is this, -2? Okay, so let's check. 3n times n, positive 3n squared, so we're good. 3n times -2, that's -6n, so we're good. So now let's look at the second group. Plus, what's the greatest common factor here? What's the greatest number that both of them have in common? I'm going to factor in -2. You'll see why. The greatest number that they have in common is just 2, but I'm going to factor in -2 because look at what happens when I factor in -2. So if I factor in -2, what do I have left? -2 times what gives me -2n, so that's n. -2 times what gives me positive 4, that's -2. I did factor in -2 because I saw that I can have the same parentheses just like we wanted, because remember, if you're going to be factoring by grouping, those parentheses have to be the same. So we're okay in this one. If I would have factored out a 2, then I would have -n plus 2, but that's not what we wanted, so I factor in -2 to fix that. Okay, so now we have it to this form. Again, look at the outsides with the outsides, so let's finish it off here. So I'm going to have 3n minus 2, that's the first group, and my second group is what I repeated, which is -n minus 2. So again, this is what we're looking for. This is the factor form, which is what we wanted. 3n minus 2 times n minus 2. Okay, now here's your entrance ticket, which is just asking you to factor the following expression. We're going to try and factor the following: 2b squared plus 11b plus 5. Again, what you want to do is rewrite the middle number and apply factoring by grouping.